I've been crocheting for several years now, and I've been interested in just history and old things for basically as long as I can remember. One would think that these two interests would have converged a long time ago, but it took me a shockingly long time to realize that there are such things as antique crochet patterns, and a lot of them are easily accessible thanks to the wonders of the internet. Who'd have thunk? When I dove down the historical crochet rabbit hole in search of projects that I could make, something I kept seeing again and again was filet crochet. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, filet crochet is basically when you use some pretty simple crochet stitches in a grid pattern, and you make either blank spaces or solid blocks arranged in such a way to make a design or a picture. It seemed this method was very popular in the past for making all sorts of things, from bedspreads to collars to lace edgings, all sorts of stuff, and some of the designs could get very intricate. I thought this would be a good project to kind of test the historical crochet waters and get used to the smaller scale that a lot of historical crochet projects tend to use. If you look at some older books, particularly as far back as the Victorian era or the earlier 20th century, a lot of them are working very, very tiny, at least much tinier than I think a lot of modern crocheters might be used to. So I thought this would also be a good project to kind of try that out and challenge myself to something new. I had used filet crochet techniques before in modern projects, so I had a pretty good idea of what I was doing. However, one thing I was not certain of for the historical filet crochet was which stitches they used and how many of them they used to make their blocks. A lot of the pattern booklets I found just contained pictographic charts with no written instructions whatsoever. It seemed like this was common enough that they could just kind of assume that you knew what you were doing. And to be fair to the publishers, a lot of them touted their designs as suitable for multiple forms of fiber crafts. So these charts could also have been used for things like cross stitch or drawn thread work, lots of other things besides just crochet. So I understand it might have been difficult to provide specific instructions for every type of craft that their designs might have been used for. Now, I could have looked up the proper method of filet crochet. However, I am lucky enough to have a real-life antique example that I could study instead. These lace scraps were passed down to me through my family. I believe they were found in my great-grandmother's house after she passed. I don't know if they're things that she actually made and used herself, or if they were just leftovers from older projects, maybe from her mother or aunts or other family members. But if family lore is correct about where they came from, they could date anywhere from the 1880s to the 1980s. Although looking at the condition of some of them and some of the staining, I'm gonna guess they're on the older end of the spectrum. Some of these also look like insertion lace, like the kind of stuff that I've been seeing in the old pattern books that I've been looking at. So linings and decorations for like petticoats and chemises and those kinds of things. So that also makes me think that these were possibly older projects. I don't know enough about like tatting or other fiber crafts to be able to recognize all of the techniques that were used in this collection. This one is knit, I can tell, but the others I'm not quite sure about. But this one, I definitely know what this is. This little like clover pattern is filet crochet, and this is the one that I am going to use as my model for my own filet crochet project. Looking at this example, I can tell that these are double crochets, American terms here. And so what it looks like they did is they started a block with a double crochet, chained 2 to make a space, and then closed it off again with another double crochet, and that's how they were making the spaces. And then for the filled in parts of the pattern, again, they're kind of starting their block with a double crochet, filling in 2 more double crochets in those spaces where the chains were, and closing it off with another double crochet. So I'm going to trust that whoever made this knew what they were doing, and I'm going to follow their lead to make my own filet crochet project. For my project, I decided that this little bookshelf needed some decoration. I came across a pattern for a table runner that had a strip of lace going up the center, bordered by fabric on each side with long fringe on the ends. I figured this would be a relatively quick project to begin with, and easily customizable to fit the dimensions of my bookcase. For the lace, I found this chart with a rose motif I thought would be the perfect choice to go along with the rest of my decor. I really like roses. For this project, I will be using some vintage crochet cotton that I picked up at an antique store. The seller didn't say how old it was, so I don't know when exactly this was produced, but it seemed appropriate to use some vintage materials for a vintage-inspired project. If you are familiar with vintage materials and you think you might know when this was produced, I would love to hear about it in the comments because I am really curious to see how old exactly this cotton is. It seems in decent shape. I don't see any weird stains or anything like that, so I'm hoping it'll be good for this project. This is the tiniest yarn that I will have ever crocheted with. I have never used crochet thread before, so wish me luck. Because this thread came in a hank, I first needed to ball it up for a smoother crocheting experience. I am aware that they make tools exactly for this purpose. I do not own those tools. If you're like me and you don't use hanks of yarn often enough to get special tools for them, you can make do with an office chair and a cardboard tube with some notches cut in it. It's not as fast or as pretty as what you get from a Winder and Swift, but it's perfectly functional. At long last, my thread was ready to crochet with, and it was finally time to bust out my itty-bitty hook and get stitching. This was the smallest I have ever gone with crochet, and I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't a bit intimidated. Turns out, I was right to be. Something about trying to work at this tiny scale just broke my brain, and I could not for the life of me figure out how to make a simple slip knot with it. The method I'd been using for years without fail suddenly eluded me, and I finally had to look up some online tutorials to figure out how to make a slip knot with this thread. I promise I know how to crochet, you guys. Honestly, I do. After that embarrassing start, things got slightly easier. I found that I needed to adjust the way I held and moved my hook, as it was a very different experience from working with my usual thicker yarn. So this is my first test swatch, and as you can see, the tension is all over the place. Even once I did start to get like a little bit better up here, it still seems kind of loose, so I'm gonna try switching to a smaller hook and see if that helps. Because I don't like all the gaps we're seeing in my chains here. So let's try a smaller hook and see what that does. Alright, this is test swatch number 2 with the smaller hook, the 1.3 millimeter hook. Tension is still not great, but it's definitely better than it was on the last one, and this is the smallest hook that I own, so I can't really go any tighter than this. So I think hopefully just more practice, and once I really get into the pattern, the tension will kind of work itself out. And blocking I know is also going to help as well. Since this is cotton, it should block fairly nicely. So we're going to move forward with this and just hope that I get better along the way. After measuring my test swatch, I realized the pretty roses I picked out were going to be far too large for this project. So I found another simpler design from the same pattern book to use instead. I think they're tulips. Despite the steep learning curve in the beginning, I did eventually get into a good rhythm and found that the project worked up pretty quickly once I got used to it. So I have finished the whole pattern. I got it as long as I want to be, but before I block it, I think I do want to make a border along the outside here just to even up these edges. I know blocking it will help a little bit, but it still is not the neatest thing ever. So for what I'm thinking, 1, I definitely want to neaten up the edges. 2, because I'm going to be attaching fabric to the sides of it, I also need something to sew into. I am going to do 1 row of single crochet along the border, followed up by a row of half double crochets. I'm hoping that will neaten up the edges and also give me enough space to sew, like seam allowance basically, for when I'm sewing the fabric to the side, so that way the fabric and the seam allowance doesn't eat up too much of the actual pattern. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. After the border was added, it was time to block it. With the crochet part done, I moved on to the fabric border. I'm using this green quilting cotton that I had left over from another project. I decided to hem all the edges before I attached it to the crochet lace, which should have been easy if my machine hadn't decided to throw a hissy fit. Oh my God, come on! We did eventually work out our differences and were able to move on with our lives. Once the fabric was all hemmed, I attached it to the crochet piece using a flat back stitch, which is a method I learned from English paper piecing quilts. I liked this stitch for this project because it kept the crochet and the fabric bits nice and flush together while being pretty much invisible from the front. After everything was sewn together, the final step was to add the fringe. I poked some holes in the fabric with needles so that I could crochet into it, creating some chain loops to knot the fringe around. Then it was just a matter of cutting and knotting lots and lots of strings. Ta-da! I am very happy with the results. Honestly, this turned out a lot better than I thought it would. I was worried going into it that with the tiny scale I was working at, that my tension was going to be like really iffy. But remember folks, blocking is your friend. Blocking your projects will hide a multitude of stitching sins. Do recommend. Really though, if you are new to the world of historical crochet, I do recommend Filet Crochet as a starter project. I know it really helped me to get more comfortable with the tinier stitches and the tinier hook size that a lot of these historical projects require, and I'm really looking forward to doing more. If you enjoy projects like this, I do have more plans for historical crochet videos along with sewing, history bounding, and bookish content. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, maybe give this a like, subscribe to the channel so you can see what else I've got coming up in the future. Until then, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.